Item number 10, update on TID districts by Ehlers and citizen questions. So I've been trying to do this every year now. We did one last May. This one will be slightly different. There is a lot of misunderstanding about TIDs, questions about TIDs. They're complicated, it's understandable. And in order to try to be transparent and inform the community about how these tools are being used by the village, I think it's good to have an annual kind of review of this, kind of where everything's at. So we're gonna do this again. I have requested that we will have a citizen question period after the presentation, which is a little unusual. But I think it's important that, and frankly, more efficient if you're able to just ask the questions tonight. So I'm thinking we can probably run this for a while. We'll let John get through his presentation, if you would, please, and then we will open it up to questions. He can back up and review slides and show exhibits again when we get to the question period. But if you would just hold your questions until he's concluded, I think we can get through this a little bit faster, and then we'll see how much time we have left, and we'll get as many questions answered as we can.
Okay.
Mr. Cameron.
Sounds good. Good evening, everybody. I'm John Cameron. I'm a senior municipal advisor with Ehlers, and I am going to talk about a number of things in relation to tax incremental financing in general. I'll start off with kind of a TID 101 type session and talk about what is tax incremental financing, how does it work, and then we'll kind of jump into the background and cash flows for both tax incremental finance districts in the village. And we'll talk first about kind of an existing cash flow analysis, assuming no additional projects are undertaken. There's a number of projects in your capital improvement plan that are TID eligible, but assuming you do none of those, or you move forward without TIF assistance for those projects, what does the cash flow of the districts, each district look like, which is one of the items we were asked to talk about this evening, and then kind of dive into the capital improvement plan as it stands right now and how the TIDs factor into that. Then kind of jump into what happens when TIF districts close. There is a one-time levy limit increase that municipalities have the option to take advantage of when a tax incremental finance district closes. So I've got an illustration for both TIF districts if they were to close today, which they can't, but if they were, what does the one-time jump look like? And what's the benefit to the village from a levy limit standpoint? And from there, from a question standpoint, we can talk about levy limits all you want. And then one of the items that we were specifically asked to talk about this evening is how do the tax incremental finance districts interact with the water utility, and a lot of the projects that you have in your capital improvement plan are related to the water utility, where these projects are TIF eligible expenses. So how to take into consideration that cash flow in the context of Public Service Commission regulation. So all water utilities are regulated by the Public Service Commission in Wisconsin. So we'll go into that as well. And then finally, one of the examples that we were also asked to comment on this evening is the assisted living facility, proposed assisted living facility for tax increment finance district number 1. What does the increment stream potentially look like for building valued at $8 million approximately, and what is the levy limit increase or bump when the TIF closes, just specifically related to the assisted living facility. So we're going to kind of talk about a lot of things, jump around to a lot of different topics, but that's really just in response to what we were asked to kind of talk about this evening. So we'll start with just the basics. So tax incremental financing in the state of Wisconsin really is the primary tool in the toolbox that municipalities have to attract and retain, and I'm sorry, I know I'm probably standing in everybody's way. I'll do my best to move, to attract and retain economic development. So just generally speaking, you hear TIF, you hear TID. What is the difference between the two? So tax incremental financing, or TIF, is the tool. And we'll talk about how it's defined here in a second. The TID refers to tax incremental district, and it is where the tool is being used physically. So the geographic boundary of the tax incremental finance district. So you kind of hear those talked about interchangeably, but really kind of the bottom line is that tax incremental financing allows municipalities to capture incremental property tax revenue from growth in that defined area and use it to benefit that defined area in terms of eligible project expenses. So when we talk about the building blocks of how a TIF actually works, these next two charts, in my opinion, are probably the simplest but most powerful way to explain how tax incremental financing works in the state of Wisconsin. So going across the horizontal axis is time, the equalized value is the vertical axis. So when a tax incremental finance district is created, so the boundary is drawn, and we'll talk specifically about TID 1 and TID 2 here in a few minutes. But at the time that the TIF district is created, the value of all property within that tax incremental finance district as it exists at the time of creation is the baseline property value. That baseline property value is frozen, and we'll talk about that in a second from a cash flow standpoint. But property taxes on that baseline value for the life of the tax incremental finance district will continue to flow to the village and the county and the school districts in this case, technical college, as they normally would. No disruption. And when a property is within a TIF district, there is no change in terms of how it's taxed. Okay, it still receives a tax bill just like everybody else with the same mill rate as everybody else in the area. Now, after the TIF district is created and value occurs, or something is redeveloped in nature, any value, taxable value that is generated above the baseline is tax incremental value, okay? So that's shown in the purple area, and the taxes, tax revenue on that purple area, that increment, is collected and remains within the TIF district to pay for eligible project expenses. At the time that the TIF district is terminated, the value that exists in full is returned to the TID outside of the property tax ledger. So you have two different sets of equalized value, and for those who were on the board last September and May, I gave kind of I'll say a local government 101, I guess, that talked about equalized value. So your mill rate or your property tax rate is based on your property tax levy divided by your total TID out equalized value. So it's the value of all property in the village less the incremental value of property within the TIF districts. That's what calculates and how you define your mill rate. So the value after TID terminates, that equalized value, in green at the very top, is returned to the TID outside of the ledger. So all things being equal, if your property tax levy is the same, say 20 years from now as it was today, you would see a property tax rate decline because your denominator has grown significantly with that increase in equalized value. So to show it a step further, this is a hypothetical example using just a round overall mill rate of $20 a thousand. So this breaks down, and this is not a real example, this is hypothetical. The local mill rate is $6.50, the county rate is $4 per thousand, the school district is $7.50, and the technical college is $2 to get to that even $20 a thousand. So, like I said, the property values, in this case, let's just talk about TID 1, TID 2. So the property values, when those two TIF districts were created, those properties as they existed at that time are frozen in nature, and taxes are collected on it, and a portion of it goes to the municipality. $4 a thousand times the total value goes to the county. $7.50 per thousand times the total base value goes to the school district. $2 a thousand goes to times the total baseline property value goes to the technical college. Any value that is tax increment value is still taxed at the same $20 a thousand, but instead of a portion of it going to the municipality and the county and the school district and the technical college, it stays within the tax incremental finance district to pay for eligible project costs. And that, in a nutshell, if there was one slide to kind of remember of how TIF works, it's this one. You get to use the overlapping taxing jurisdictions, taxing authority to collect tax revenue and pay for eligible project expenses with a universal goal of attracting, retaining, and promoting economic development.
Each of those entities has representation and votes, and in Lannon's case, voted to approve that. So they know and they're in agreement with that.
Yep, I'll talk about that just for a second. So why use tax incremental financing? Why do municipalities across the state use it? One, it requires cost participation amongst all taxing jurisdictions that will ultimately benefit from increased property values. It promotes economic development and redevelopment by, again, taking those tax dollars within that specific geographic area and using it to pay for eligible project costs to allow that development to occur. In most cases, you see TIF districts being used for lack of infrastructure or for extraordinary costs. With TIF 1 and TIF 2, there was blasting, there was other extraordinary costs that were associated with those developments, as well as infrastructure that needed to be put in to allow those TIF districts to occur and develop, and allow developers to be able to do so while earning a reasonable rate of return. It addresses a lack of other incentives and financial resources again, but for the use of tax incremental financing, these properties would continue to sit vacant. It promotes cooperation between public and private sectors. And this is an old kind of bullet, but initially it was put in, TIF goes back to 1976, and it was initially put in place to counteract the economic downturn of the mid-1970s. The linchpin for tax incremental financing in Wisconsin is what's called the but-for test. It is a standard, as Ben mentioned, so that when a TIF district is created, there's a number of steps, and if you were back in 2018, you went through those steps. Once the project plan, which is the document that has all of the pertinent information on the tax incremental financing, once that's prepared, it goes before the Joint Review Board. The Joint Review Board is made up of representatives of all of those overlapping taxing jurisdictions within the TIF district area, within the TID. So it's made up of a representative from the village, as well as a public member that is recommended by the village, but voted on by the other Joint Review Board members. It's made up of a representative from the county, the school district, and the technical college. And their job is really to vote to say whether or not that but-for test has been met. And really, the thing to think about with but-for is but-for the use of tax incremental financing, the proposed development would either not occur as proposed within the same time frame as it would be with the use of tax incremental financing, or within the same level of value and quality that you want to see. So there's a number of ways that it can be proved. You can go through an independent third-party review of a developer's sources and uses and cash flows with and without the use of tax incremental finance assistance. A development agreement is required for any form of assistance. It really can be also just identifying the site as a challenge site with extraordinary cost of infrastructure, as well as just extraordinary development costs, extensive public infrastructure costs, and lack of economic development in the community as a whole. Ultimately, this is the joint review board's call. And back in 2018, when these two TIF districts were created, these votes went through unanimously by the joint review board. With a resounding yes. So that's kind of a high level overview of the TIF districts. So to get a little bit more specific into TIF 1 and TIF 2, just the facts for TIF 1, this TIF district was created in July of 2018 as a mixed use district, which means it has a maximum lifespan of 20 years under state statutes. It was amended in 2022 to add territory as well as subtract some territory. I'll show you that in a second. And then to amend the project costs that were in the project plan. It has an expenditure period that ends in 2033 and a mandatory termination date in July of 2038. It has been very successful in terms of the value that has occurred and currently has a little over $113 million in incremental value within that TIF district. And the new incremental values as of January 1st, 2025 will come out this summer. So in August, we'll know what the new values and what was added for construction or economic appreciation that would have occurred in 2024, valued as of January 1, 2025. So this map is the boundary of the TIF district. It's a little hard to see on screen, big area. So in red here is the original boundary of the TIF district. There, the spotted areas in red were the areas that were added in 2022 as part of that amendment. And then these hashed areas here were the areas that were subtracted from the district when it was created with the 2022 amendment. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind with tax incremental financing is that number one, the boundary has to be contiguous in nature. So you cannot leapfrog over properties in order to say, well, we think there's going to be development here and here. You have to keep the boundary contiguous in nature. The boundary also has to contain the whole parcel. So you cannot pull in a portion of a parcel. It has to contain the entire parcel. From a cash flow standpoint, and I'll walk from left to right, there's a number of things to kind of talk about. So on the far left-hand side of the screen is the annual tax increment revenue. So I just started it in 2024. We did get your draft audit. So we were able to pull in the cash flow for the district in terms of revenues and expenses for the year, and really just bottom line the current fund balance for that, which your auditor doesn't expect to change materially between now and when it ultimately is finalized and published. But along with that, there is an annual reporting requirement that has to occur. You've got to file a form with the Department of Revenue by July 1st, which is fast approaching, and conduct an annual meeting of the Joint Review Board. So you'll see another kick at this as we do that annual meeting, but this is where we are right now. So we've got tax incremental finance revenues kind of in the first column here, and I'll jump around here. Estimated interest earning when we get to a point of having positive fund balance, kind of going up across the page. So total revenues here. There's a number of different debt obligations that are outstanding. There was general obligation promissory notes that were taken out in 2020. There were general obligation notes also in 2020 on a taxable basis. There was a state trust fund loan that was taken out in 2022 and another one in 2023. So in terms of hard general obligation debt obligations, you've got 4 that are currently outstanding within that district. A couple of things to point out. The longest running one ends in 2036 with the state trust fund loan from 2022. The other thing is this general obligation promissory note from 2020 does have a balloon payment at the end of it at $995,000. We're currently showing that to be paid with cash within the district, but you could certainly also elect to refund that and stretch it out really out through the remaining life of the TIF district if you so choose. That's your decision as the board. Beyond that obligation, beyond those debt obligations, there's a series of municipal revenue obligations. So Overstone, you've got, agreements with them that has, a couple of different, MROs. The first two were paid with the, debt that was issued with the state trust fund loans and other obligations. But you've got annual, municipal revenue obligations that really run out through the remaining life of the tax incremental finance district. And then you also have MRO with Rock Point development that also runs out through the lifespan of the district. So what's the difference between general obligation debt and a municipal revenue obligation? General obligation debt counts towards a village's overall level of indebtedness. All municipalities in the state of Wisconsin have a finite amount of general obligation borrowing capacity, and that is no more than 5% of your total equalized value. A municipal revenue obligation is really an annual appropriation of tax increment revenue related to the development that is made available per the terms of the development agreement. The biggest difference is that it is not a general obligation of the municipality because of that annual appropriation clause. So the nice thing about it, there's a couple of nice features, is that number one, it preserves your borrowing capacity for other projects, roads, buildings, equipment, vehicles, those types of things that you might otherwise need to borrow for. The other thing is that it relies upon the developer, upfronting the cash, doing the project, producing, as they say they're going to produce, in order to generate the property tax revenue that they said they would do as part of the development agreement to get themselves paid back for their infrastructure and other development expenses. So this goes to kind of the first set of questions that we were asked to talk about tonight is, if you did no other projects beyond what is currently in the TIF district, what is really the estimated point right now that the TIF district could potentially close? And that's shown here in tan in 2033. So that really would be the point, without doing any additional projects, that your cumulative fund balance would exceed your liabilities outstanding. Okay. Then switching over to TIF district number 2. TIF district number 2 was also created in July of 2018. But this was created as a rehabilitation district, which really means that it has a longer lifespan than a mixed-use district. And the type of TIF district is really established at the time the district is created based on the existing and proposed land uses. So this district, as it was defined back then, was in significant need of rehabilitation within the different properties within the districts, which qualifies it for a longer lifespan. This was also amended in August of 2022 from a boundary standpoint and from a project standpoint. It has an expenditure period that ends in July of 2040, mandatory termination date July of 2045, and it currently has a little over $22 million in incremental value within the TIF district. So one thing I do want to hit here, because you might be thinking about it, is when we talk about an expenditure period within the context of a TIF district, what does that mean? What it means is that is the last date in which the village can enter into a contract to take on an eligible project. And that could be entering into a development agreement for an incentive. It could also mean entering into a construction contract to take on an eligible TIF expense. Beyond the expenditure period, so the expenditure period for a TIF district always is 5 years before the maximum lifespan of the district. So beyond it, once you pass that expenditure period, you can continue to pay debt on existing obligations. You can continue to pay on existing municipal revenue obligations and other obligations within the TIF district. You just can't take on new expenses, new projects. Okay, the boundary of the TIF district is shown here. This is Main Street, Whispering Ridge here, and then the expansion outward. So this is the solid red line, sorry, is the initial boundary of the TIF district, and then the dotted areas. Dotted area was the, expansion, of the TIF district in 2022 as part of that amendment. And then this hashed area here was a subtraction that was also completed, in 2022. So there was some property that was removed, when that 2022 amendment was done, just like within TIF district number 1. So same sort of question and analysis. Let's look at the cash flow for the district, assuming no new projects with current values. So this does not include, so if you think about the value that is likely going to hit with the 2025 equalized values is the development right across from St. John's, the Sewall development. The name of it is totally. Thank you, yeah. So that value, you'll see part of it come on in 2025 and likely the remaining value coming on in 2026. So that is not factored into the revenues that you see here, but will come online very soon. So the tax revenues here again are going down the page. With TID 1 and TID 2, one thing we did factor into these cash flows is a 1.5% of appreciation factor on the incremental value that's there. So assume that that increases by about 1.5% annually. So you might say, well, you have no new development, but your revenue is going up. So what does that mean? Does it mean your property tax, we're assuming your property tax rate is staying stable. We're assuming about a 1.5% depreciation factor. And I think that's fairly conservative. So total tax revenues going on down the page out through 2046 actually. So 2045 is the last date when the TID would end, but because the TID is closing after April 15th, you'll collect increment into the following year. You've got one taxable issue that was that's outstanding with a total par amount of $515,000 that runs out through 2030, and then you have a municipal revenue obligation for the Wren development that has annual paygo provisions at 50% of the increment that is generated that runs out through 2032. So as it stands right now, again, based on the current cumulative balance within the TID and the known development compared to the known expenses, this district could close as soon as 2031, and just in a matter of a couple months, we'll be able to update this again once we get the new equalized values. Okay, so that's kind of where the TIDs stand today. Jumping into kind of the next step, which is you have a number of projects that are identified in your capital improvement plan that were part of the original TID project plans and the amendments that are TID eligible. So not all of the projects here are TID eligible expenses, but there's a number of them that are. So I can kind of read through this, and Ben, feel free to jump in here too as it pertains to the CIP. But you've got lift station upgrades to Good Hope Road and Main Street, Good Hope Road reconstruction work, public art signage, streetscaping, water facility electrical upgrades, Good Hope Road water mains, both phase 1 and phase 2, and a new water tower on the sewer side, a lift station facility and pumping upgrades. There's capacity payment for wastewater treatment capacity to the village of Sussex. Lannon interceptor inflow and infiltration reduction costs. There is potentially capacity purchase from Sussex on the water side for cost sharing for new well facility. I'll just put a kind of a big asterisk at that number right now that is a placeholder. There's obviously a significant amount of potential negotiations, and I'm sure that Sussex has asked for much more than what you have listed in this sheet in terms of capacity for that share of the well facility. There's also an interconnect for water main extension, Jacques Park bike path extension, Pocket Park costs, and Bonnie Lane reconstruction costs. So you can see in terms of purpose that some of these are related to both TIF districts 1 and 2. Some of them are related to TIF districts 1 and 2 and the sewer utility. Some of them are water related, a lot of them are water related, and also TIF eligible expenses. Some of them are just general fund expenses, like Jocks Park, for example. In part, some of them are just related solely to the utility, do not have a benefit to the TIF district and are just general utility expenses that are being taken on. So this is, I think, an estimate of where you potentially stand today and the projects that could exist to the tune of approximately $15.3 million. So this is an update to a presentation, an initial capital improvement plan that the village's engineer provided to us last fall. And we did a presentation before the board on how this might get financed and what the debt service payments might look like and how the TIDs might be able to help contribute towards these project expenses. I think, one of the things we'll talk about here is that the TIF districts, now are in a position where you have a substantial amount of known incremental value revenue. They're supporting their own project expenses. You'll within the next few years turn into a positive fund balance. You've got the opportunity, if you so choose to, these are eligible expenses, to take on those expenses to the benefit of the taxpayers of the village, because they'll be borne by the TIF district. Again, assuming you choose to move forward with those projects and assuming you're going to allocate those expenses to the TIF district as they were originally intended. The other item that the TIF districts pay for annually is some annual administrative operating expenses, approximately $37,500 for TIF District 1 and about $20,000 for TIF District 2. So when you think about where your levy limit is and the amount that you're levying the TIF district, it's not meant to be a supplement to the general fund, but it is meant to help carry some eligible administrative expenses, and it does to the tune of $57,500 approximately. So within the capital improvement plan, right here for a second. What we looked at, and this is for those who were on the board back this fall, this is kind of an update to this spreadsheet, is we looked at, the project costs that are allocated to the water utility and then the roads and the general fund. The sewer utility project costs are estimated to be paid for within cash within the sanitary sewer utility. So, but you have a number of costs. From a roads perspective, it's mainly Good Hope Road, a portion of that from a reconstruction effort, and then a number of different water projects that are TID eligible, partially TID eligible expenses. The total principal expense that the TID can carry, both TIDs can carry right now, is approximately $7,850,000 of additional expenses from that CIP. So a pretty significant bite of the projects that are listed in your capital improvement plan can be supported by the tax incremental finance district, potentially more than that, depending on how the debt is structured. And if you're willing to, potentially refinance that balloon payment and stretch that out, that helps with the cash flow within TID 1. It helps the TID be able to take on in the middle part some additional debt without running a negative, going back to a negative cumulative deficit out at that point in time. So for simplicity at this point, for the new project costs and the amount that the TIDs can support, we allocated 80% of those costs to TID 1, 20% of those costs to TID 2. Again, we might be able to play around with that and restructure as the project gets closer, as things get more well known, and as you say, we are going to move ahead with these projects. But that gives you a rough idea of what's potentially doable right now. So how does that change the cash flow? The first page is no different than what I showed previously. Total revenues, your debt obligations as they exist right now. But then going into the second page, Same set of MRO payments to both Overstone and Rock Point. But then when we get into the newer items, what we did is we started adding in principal and interest payments on future debt, really starting, in 2020, as soon as 2029. You have debt payments that potentially could exist sooner than that. If we add that in, we may run into a potential cumulative deficit, but we could possibly stretch that debt out over a little bit better period of time. The thing about TID 1 is that it has a lot of increment. There's a lot of cash flow that's being generated on an annual basis, but unlike TIF District 2, it has a shorter lifespan. So the longer that you go without doing projects, so this is now probably maybe the third iteration of that CIP, and as projects continue to move further out, it just shortens the amount of time that we have to repay that expense. So, there's still a considerable amount of buying power within this TIF district, especially if, we continue to see an increase in equalized value within this TIF. Although I realize that, we've seen a tremendous amount already. But, starting in the future, you'll have, annual principal and interest payments that could be taken on. But what it's going to realistically mean for the TIF district is that you'll likely extend that district out to potentially its full lifespan out in 2039 instead of closing it, earlier, possibly in 2038. But it'll most certainly go out much longer. TIF district number 2, kind of the same setup. Revenues, existing revenues, no change. Existing debt and MRO, no change. Future debt starting to get layered in, as it's able. We get skinny, very skinny from a positive cumulative balance. And then we rebound very heavily as our existing debt and MROs are satisfied. So really all of the increment that's being generated could go towards projects. The other thing is we have, life on the back end that we're not utilizing right now for debt. We could structure that debt out further and pick up some other, pieces of the projects that are in the CIP, increase the amount that's allocated to TIF district number 2. It's just a matter of, appetite from a board perspective and, willingness to finance projects over a longer period of time.
And this is without any of the Stonewood Trail
That's
development in here.
Yeah, that's correct.
So we'll add about, speculating maybe another 70%. Instead of 22 million in increment in that district, and there's 32 units there. If you figure 500,000, that's 16 million.
So it could easily, go quite a bit higher.
Yeah.
Okay, so transitioning to one of the other topics we were asked to talk about tonight is what happens when a TIF district closes. So when a TIF district closes, there is under state law, there is a one-time levy limit increase that you can take advantage of. And this first slide is just to show this very simplistically. So in the state of Wisconsin, and for those on the board, you're probably very familiar with this, going through your budget process. All municipalities are subject to levy limits. And really from a very simplistic standpoint, what it means is that municipalities can really only increase their tax levy for operating expenses by the percentage increase in net new construction. In some cases, 0 if there really isn't any net new construction. So net new construction is defined as new construction less the value of any demolition expenses. Okay, so if you think about, say, a building that gets torn down and rebuilt, the difference between the building value as it exists now and the new value is your net new construction. So you've had years here with the tax incremental finance districts, primarily where you've had very good percentages of net new construction growth. Prior to the TIDs being created, there was very, very little net new construction growth. And I'll show you an illustration of what happens when the TID closes, and you can see your total mill rate and what that might mean here in a second. So how this works is, you get, you start with your final TID incremental value. So, we'll show you that for TID one here in a second, but think about that roughly $113 million. In this case, we're using just a very simplistic, $15 million. The TID out equalized value is $500 million of the municipality. So the final percentage of TID, of increment as a percent of TID out equalized value, that $15 million divided by the 500 million is 3%. You get 50%, which equals 3%. You get 50% of that impact at the time the TID closes. So in this example, you get a 1.5% bump to your property tax levy. So the other thing to think about is, is the closure process. So for example, if the last year incremental value is January 1st, 2024, it's reflected on your 2025 levy limit worksheet, and you'll actually realize the benefit in 2026. There's also an adjustment on a subtraction of territories as well. So to take this a step further, if we look at just what does it look like today and what might that levy limit bump look like right now? So this comes right from your submitted levy limit worksheet for budget year 2025. So you have your prior year's actual levy plus personal property aid, so 2024 budget of $700,903. You subtract from that the amount of general obligation debt that you claimed on last year's taxing or levy limit worksheet, which was $52,218. So your adjusted actual property tax levy going into this year was $648,685. So in the case of a TIF district, so this is for TIF one, the TID incremental value was right now is $113,603,200. Your total projected TID out equalized value, as it exists now, is a little over $200 million. That 113 divided by the 201 and then multiplied by 50% is a 28% bump to a one-time bump to your levy limit. So you would get at the time of TID closure, assuming it closed today, you can realize the increase to your property tax levy of $183,200. And that'll be adjusted as you go throughout time. Presumably, up potentially, but likely up. But so, if you think about your referendum efforts and just, the budgets and what you're looking for, what TID one could potentially do, it's about $183,200 bump to your property tax levy. TID two, same set of numbers, adjusted actual tax levy of $648,685. When we look at the value, the incremental value at TID one of TID two of $22,291,400 divided by our TID out equalized value multiplied by 50%, we get a levy limit increase of 5.54% or $35,948. So switching gears again to address one of the other questions that came up is a lot of your projects are related to the water utility that are also TID eligible. The way that the Public Service Commission defines the revenue requirement for the water utility means these water projects will also have an impact on your user rate. So how does tax incremental financing interact with the way that the Public Service Commission sets and defines water rates in the state of Wisconsin? So the revenues that you need to generate from your user rates to operate the utility on an annual basis, and when you go in for a rate case through the Public Service Commission, the amount of money that you need to operate the utility is simply defined as your revenue requirement. So the way that the Public Service Commission defines the revenue requirement for water utilities is making sure that you're recovering 100% of your operating and maintenance expenses. So your operating and maintenance expenses that are related to the water utility, those are budgeted for and recovered through your user rates. Your taxes and transfer payments in lieu of taxes to general fund are also included in here. And then from a capital standpoint, the way that capital is recovered through your user rates is through depreciation and a rate of return on your existing rate base. Those are not cash expenses. You're not writing a check for depreciation. You're not writing a check for a return on your rate base. But the way that they're defined is depreciation at a high level standpoint recovers the principal of your water utility assets over their lifespan. Your rate of return at a high level recovers the interest expense on the assets over that same period of time. And in the absence of debt financing, it really is a measure of, if you think of it from like a business standpoint, you know, your rate of return is a measure of financial strength and health, and really a signalization of a business, or in this case, a public utilities, ability to reinvest in itself, okay? So these two items together, depreciation and rate of return, when you add them up, they need to be sufficient to pay on a cash basis your debt service payments, any sort of debt coverage requirements that you have on those debt obligations, any cash funded capital expenses. So the way that Public Service Commission views assets that are financed through by TIF is that they are no different than any assets that would be put in by the utility itself, meaning that you have to earn depreciation on those assets, and you also have to earn a rate of return on those assets. So when they get booked into service, different than say assets that are specially assessed or recovered with impact fees or other types of contributions from developers, you're required to earn depreciation and a rate of return on those assets. However, where PSC will deviate from this process, and you know, when you go in for your next rate case, there's work to be done with working with PSC and potentially taking this to the full commission, is to reduce or request a reduced rate of return that really is a 1-for-1 reduction of rate base on dollars to the tax incremental revenue that you're taking in, so that you can realize that you have another revenue source with TIF 1 and TIF 2 that is helping pay for project expenses. Therefore, we do not need as high of a rate of return because we have an alternate revenue source that is benefiting the water utility. So that lowers your revenue requirement, really, again, on a 1-to-1 basis with the revenue that you're taking in from the two tax incremental financial districts. The final question that we were asked to address, and then happy to turn it back over for questions, is the assisted living facility. You know, what does that potentially look like in terms of tax incremental revenues coming in to TIF 1 through its remaining lifespan, and what happens, what is the impact from a levy closure standpoint when the TIF would close. So the value that we were provided was at $8 million. They just assumed that construction would happen all in one fell swoop in 2025. Perhaps that's not realistic in terms of timing, but based on just the existing total tax rate. It's hard to see on the screen, I apologize. The total tax increment, if the TIF district would run its full lifespan, and the value doesn't change, nor the tax rate, would be a little over $3.2 million of additional revenue to TIF district number 1. So that's not in the cash flow right now. that we just talked through. But would be, as soon as that value is known and recognized. If you take it a step further and say what happens with just this piece of it when the TIF district closes and what sort of levy limit adjustment might we realize, it's about a 2% increase to your levy, about $12,901. And if you think back, this is kind of off topic as it relates to the assisted living facility, but if you think about levy limits themselves and the increase in net new construction, so think of it this way, a 2%, bump is a little over $12,000 prior to those TIF districts. If you had years with net new construction that was at 1% or less, and you think about your adjusted levy at about 650,000, multiply that by 1%, 2%, that's it in terms of increase to your property tax levy. Then think about where we've been from an inflationary standpoint in terms of expenses, fuel, electricity, and that's before you even talk about salaries, benefits, those types of things. So it just kind of puts it into perspective a little bit, what you're dealing with and what all municipalities are dealing with and the power that growth can have, because we really, in Wisconsin, we are for the most part right now, 100% reliant upon property tax revenue for revenue generation. At least at the municipality level. Counties obviously are different with sales tax revenue. So those are all of the items that I was asked to address and everything that's on here. I will turn it back over to you, Mr. President.
All right, thank you, John. So that's a lot to digest. So what I'd like to do is open it up to some questions now. I think what we'll do as a point of order for that is I'd like to allow the board members to ask some questions, and we'll move to the public to ask some questions. For any of you that are watching online and would like to ask a question, you can use the chat feature. Trustee Lake is monitoring that, and we will read those and address those after the folks that are present here. I will kick it off with a couple of questions that I feel like are no-brainer questions from the presentation. If the TID closes with a positive balance, what happens to the money?
Okay, good question. TIF districts that close with a positive fund balance, that positive fund balance is distributed to all of the overlapping taxing jurisdictions in proportion to the tax levies within the municipality as laid out in the statement of taxes, which is a document that gets filed with the Department of Revenue. So back to that $20 a thousand example is probably easiest to see it, here.
So in that example, the proportions of each of those four taxing authorities,
Yeah,
that's the percentage they get back.
yeah. Correct. Yeah, so, the school district would get not quite half, but, school, in most municipalities, your school district is the highest,
Sure.
total mill rate, but it gets divvied up proportionately. If you take each number divided by the total mill rate, that gives you a percentage of how it gets distributed. On the flip side, if the TIF district closes with a negative fund balance, that liability remains with the village. It does not get shared by the overlapping taxing jurisdictions. So the overlapping taxing jurisdictions get to share in the success, but if it closes with a shortfall, they're not on the hook for those costs.
Okay, my second question is, you mentioned a couple of bumps in your hypotheticals. I asked you to present, what are the impacts that these have in a TID closure? So to talk about these bumps, how does that affect people's taxes, or does it affect people's taxes, and if so, how?
When the TIF closes, you mean?
Yeah.
So when the TIF closes, you get the one-time increase to your total levy. And that is an optional take it or lose it scenario. So from a board standpoint, you have the ability to take it, which I would strongly suggest you do. But you also don't have to. So your levy would go up if you take it. But your divisor in terms of your TID out equalized value, that also increases because all of that increment goes to from the TID inside of the ledger to the TID outside of the ledger. So all other things being equal, your mill rate will go down. So it could be a situation where you're increasing your levy with the one-time adjustment, but that gets more than offset with the increase in property value. Not saying that'll happen, but you know, you've got a considerable amount of value in TID one alone, so.
So it's hypothetically possible that when the TIDs do close and you take these bumps, assuming that that's the policy decision that gets made at the time, you could actually see a reduction in property taxes.
Yeah, you could. And one strategy that some municipalities will elect to do around a TIF closure is, you know, beyond just what's in the CIP or within the CIP itself, depending on how, you know, if there's projects that fall outside of the TID, is take on, a lot of municipalities will choose to take on a large project, do a borrowing with the debt levy coming on in conjunction with the increase in TID out value coming online, so that you can do a project without seeing the corresponding increase to the mill rate. So it's something to think about, you know, as you go out into the future.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board? I'm sure we've got.
You
some.
keep saying TIF instead of TID. So if I'm understanding right, TIF is the base.
TIF is,
It's the total baseline property, right? What you're saying there.
no, TIF really is,
That's TID.
TIF is the tool, TID is the
Right.
geographic area where the tool is used.
Okay,
So TIF is this.
okay. Can the TIF be closed if TID 1 and 2 are not ready to be closed?
Well, municipalities, there's three situations when a TIF can be closed. One is it reaches the end of its maximum lifespan. The other is that your cumulative fund balance exceeds your liabilities outstanding. You paid for your project costs, and that's really your best case scenario and what you want to see, that the cumulative fund balance exceeds our liabilities outstanding, and we're closing the TIF district early. The third is that we're voluntarily closing the TIF district early, but it has not recovered all of the liabilities. In a situation like that, any liabilities that are still outstanding have to be borne by the general property tax levy and the utilities to the extent that they're eligible. In your case, you have, you know, a number of development agreements that really commit you to you know, portions of incremental revenue and run out for a number of years yet.
Yeah, we have TID 1 and TID 2. Right.
I have a request. The people online cannot see the screen, and so would you be able to provide me at some point the PowerPoint that I can share with everybody online?
Yeah,
so that
absolutely.
they can analyze the numbers a little bit closer.
Sure.
They can hear you. My question is, in particular, when we looked at the capital improvement plans that are TID eligible. Let's run a hypothetical that the village of Lannon never created a tax incremental district or multiples of them. And yet we still needed to do a water project, and we still needed to upgrade a EV lift station, and we needed to do infrastructure, maintenance. What would our option be? How would we handle that if we did not have TID eligible funds available to basically borrow against?
There's, I guess, a number of things to kind of unpack with a question like that. Number one, when you look at these projects and the nature of these projects, there's really two ways that projects can be financed in Wisconsin. There's general obligation debt and revenue bond debt. So we talked about general obligation debt before. and the limits of that 5% of your equalized value. So one of the things that, the increase in value has done is it's increased your borrowing capacity because that 5% of your total TID-in value has grown. So it's given you the ability to fund these projects, even though you might have abatement sources that might abate the property tax levy with general obligation debt, with TID revenues and revenues potentially of the utilities. It's given you the ability to finance those projects. So if you didn't have the TIF districts, if you didn't have that value, your borrowing capacity would be smaller than it is today. So we likely wouldn't have the ability to finance the projects entirely that we see on screen. The other way to finance projects is with revenue bond debt. Revenue bond debt is supported by the revenues of the pledged utility. So water utility rates for water projects, sewer user rates for sewer projects. So you can take on as much revenue bond debt as your revenue structure can support, but it's always that the time the debt is taken out, you're really looking at how much debt it can support in arrears. So you're in the official statement for the debt, which is the primary offering document. You're relying on last year's financial statements, your last year's audit with revenues and expenses to prove that you have the financial wherewithal to take on those borrowings. So what it would require is significant user rate increases, really prior to the projects being financed, so that you've got the ability to then take on the debt. Or it would require you to do interim financing, so kind of like think of like a construction loan or something like that. So financing on a short-term basis, do those rate increases, then come back and refinance the debt with permanent revenue bond debt. So though that's what you'd have to do in order to do it, and you'd have to take on the corresponding user rate increases really within the context of a water utility. Sewers been financially in a pretty good position.
I will just add a little context to that. If I remember correctly, when we were looking at forming these TIDs, I think our equalized value was about 140 million or so in the entire village. Significantly less than where it is. And we had debt, and our borrowing capacity was very, very limited at the time.
And that was exactly Mr. Cameron, you're way smarter than I am, and you do an incredible job of explaining the minutia. But the big picture is that TID is a good way for a municipality of our size to foster an environment of development of underutilized lands. I mean, the real simple thing about it is if we look at the proposed development on the east side of town, that is agricultural land, and it's taxed at a rate of an agricultural and partial wetland, And what it will do is it will allow an environment that is conducive to entice someone to make a development, which then is taxed at the rate of that development. And the big picture to me as a board member is that every single budget cycle, we are counting pennies. And that is counting pennies to get the salt on the streets and to plow. It's not counting, let's improve the park, or let's do something nice to make the community nicer. I really see the TIDs as a vehicle to be able to do the development, which will increase the ultimate tax base and the infrastructure that needs to happen to not only support the growth, but also maintain a quality of life for everyone who's been here. Old properties, new developments, single family business. And that's all I wanted to point out. And you've done a really good job of the dollars and cents, but I wanted to take it back to a big picture. How did the board in the early days before I was here look at it and say, how are we not just gonna annex ourselves to Menominee Falls? Or how are we gonna maintain our autonomy? How are we going to keep Lannon something that moves into the future. And, you know, so I appreciate the minutia, but also the big picture of it is a tool that we've used, and I think we've used it really successfully.
I've got a couple questions. So like the proposed senior living facility, if that or something similar to that were to be developed that is not for profit or tax exempt, how does that fall into this category? Because that would not be incurring or contributing revenue.
Yeah, you're right. So something,
Allow that.
something that isn't, that would go into a tax incremental finance district would not be obviously taxed. Oftentimes what you see in lieu of that is the municipality through a development agreement entering into what's referred to as a pilot payment or a payment in lieu of taxes that would essentially look at what the property might otherwise be valued at, or what we need in terms of revenue on an annual basis to pay for the project expenses that development is benefiting from, and receive payments, you know, that way. So back to the cash flow of the district, instead of taxing, you'd have another column. So instead of tax incremental revenue, you'd have pilot payment revenue from that, you know, facility that would come in for a, you know, defined period of time. Could be, you know, it could be done in the TIF district, and that could be as a condition of allowing the property to develop in that space.
But there would be no actual funds that would come in. There would be a pilot revenue or evaluation, but there'd be no.
No,
tax
that
dollars.
would be actual cash coming in. So you wouldn't get tax revenue, but you would get a payment in lieu of taxes. You'd get cash from that property that would come into the TIF district. So it wouldn't be tax revenue because obviously it's tax exempt, but it would be revenue, you know, per the terms of an agreement that would come in and flow in through the TIF district. And I'm sure Hector could probably do a better job of explaining that than I did.
That would be per the terms of the development agreement.
That's what you'd want to structure, because again, what you're saying is, but for the use of tax incremental financing, these properties wouldn't have developed. And that likely then comes with, in this case, significant expense. There's infrastructure and other things that have been made available to allow that development to occur. It just so happens that the development that might be the best and highest use does not pay property taxes. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but in just kind of following your scenario here. So in lieu of that, then you would calculate or come to, you know, terms with that developer for a payment in lieu of taxes that could go to help pay for eligible TIF expenses.
Okay.
I think I said that okay. I didn't step out of line.
I got a couple, three more. So with MROs, I guess, you gave a couple examples about how, like, what hypothetical, if TID 1 or TID 2 were to close early. The sheet I have in front of me is the TID 1 sheet. That's slide 12, I think. And it shows that TID 1 could potentially, you have it indicated, shadowed, that it could potentially close in 2033. But we have our Rock Point MROs, or the kickbacks that we gave to Rock Point, project to 2038. So hypothetically, if we close at 2033, does Rock Point lose the kickbacks from 2033 to 2038? Or would the village then need to make a lump sum payment to Rock Point
So
at closure?
yeah, there's a couple of ways it could be handled. You could do a lump sum payment, or you could keep those funds in escrow, close the district, put those funds in escrow, and then continue to pay them out through the term of the development agreement. So
Okay,
you'd still close the district, but that when you do a closure, there's an audit that also has to get done for the TIF district. So that would say these of the cumulative fund balance, these remaining, whatever the sum is of these remaining payments would be put into escrow for Rock Point and continue to get paid out for a defined period of time for the development agreement.
okay, so those obligations that it is debt, right? There's no way, even if the debt,
It's
even if we close early, we're still obligated to pay that money to the developer.
correct.
How do you guys get paid? I think there was a question that came on Facebook, as to how Ehlers gets paid. Is it an origination fee only that's included in part of the cost of preparing these proposals and these TID districts? Is it a recurring fee that you guys acquire? Can you explain that to us?
So, at the time the TIF district is created, we had a scope of services that was, agreed upon by the village board for a fixed fee amount to create the TIF district project plan. At that time, I think we were charging about 15,000 to create a tax incremental finance district. So 15,000 for TIF 1 and 15,000 for TIF 2. So the way that we work is we have a fixed fee for the creation of a tax incremental finance district that includes the preparation of the project plan, attending all of the meetings, filing those documents then with the Department of Revenue. And then in addition to that, to satisfy your annual meeting requirement, we facilitate the annual meeting of the Joint Review Board. That includes updating the cash flow for the TIF district and then attending and facilitating and attending that Joint Review Board meeting. And I want to say we charge about $2,500 for that on an annual basis.
Okay, and then, so that 2,500 is above and beyond the
The original
origination?
creation, yeah,
Okay, is there, when we make amendments, is that a separate fee structure as well?
it is. And to do an amendment to a TIF district is the same as creating it. You've got to go through the exact same steps. So it's really the same cost. But obviously, if you're not going to amend the district, you incur that cost. So you've done one amendment to date, so.
Okay, thank you. One, I think, final question. So a couple other people have indicated that Lannon has a general, general ledger, budgetary concerns and constraints. And so there's a lot of budgetary issues that we've faced and dealt with over several years. So that's why I think there's been so many questions about the benefits of potentially closing these, what impact that has on the tax levy. And I guess kind of where I'm leading with this is there was a slide on here which indicated that we contribute from the TIDs to administrative costs. Can we contribute more to our administrative costs?
Really,
Yeah. We had concerns with funding our police department. There's got to be a mechanism that we can contribute from, we have a large amount of money in these TIDs. It's crazy that we can't pull money from this to take care of, especially because this growth puts a burden on our police department. I think a lot of our call volume goes to these areas where this growth is. So I guess there's got to be a way to offset some of that cost with some of this, right?
from a statutory standpoint, you're not eligible to or allowed to allocate those types of expenses to the tax incremental finance district. It really is defined in statutes to capital expenses, specifically, related to costs that are necessary to allow the development to occur. So, when you think back to the TIF district, there is kind of a trade-off between wanting to try to get as much projects as you can done, and you've got a considerable lift in terms of potential projects, but also wanting to try to close the district to get that newly created value to the TID outside of the ledger, as well as to get that one-time levy limit bump. And part of that one-time levy limit bump is to help with those operating related expenses. That's what the legislature defined when they created tax incremental financing. I wish it was different, but it's not.
I guess to follow up, then, I think you showed admin expenses are 3% of something, like, is that a prescribed amount and what is it?
Goes back to when the TIF district was created, in terms of administrative, it's really time spent dealing with the TIF district from an administrative cost benefit. So you've got some fixed costs like part of the audit that is related to the TIF district that gets rolled into that, as well as just some staff time that is allocated to the TIF district. So it's meant to recover proportionate share of costs that are really because of the TIF from an administrative standpoint, but not true operating like police and fire and which I get, because you're right. I mean, there are costs, operating costs for, serving those areas that you're not able to recover from a statutory standpoint through the tax incremental finance district.
In that administrative percentage, does that also include some of the fees that trustee Batiste was questioning or the costs
Yeah,
associated with the
it does.
TIDs? Those are all attributed back to the TIDs themselves, correct?
Absolutely. Yep, those are TIF eligible expenses. Yeah, they're not being borne by the general fund.
Okay, I have a few questions. John, you've articulated a lot of the benefits of a TIF and the TID districts, so I appreciate that. What you really haven't talked about too much is some of these shortfalls. Okay, and Dan touched on this, it diverts revenue from basic services. So you freeze the tax base at pre-development levels. And then any increase in the property tax revenue, it goes to the TIF district rather than to the general municipal funds where we pay for our services. And so, we know we're struggling to meet our general revenue obligations. And, short of asking for more tax dollars via referendums, what are some other ways you would propose?
Well, I guess maybe there's kind of two parts to the question in terms of some of the negatives of TIF and then other revenue generation. The referendum for municipalities right now is the biggest tool in the toolbox. It really is. And if you're paying attention to sources like the League of Municipalities and kind of follow some of the news that they're publishing, you saw there are a lot of municipalities that went out for referendum with the spring election this year, and several others that went out in fall, most of which were not successful. So I think the public in general is getting more used to, referendums pretty much used to exclusively live on the school district side. It's now becoming a necessity to try to go out for referendum on the municipal side, just because we're 20 years from the inception of levy limits, give or take. Most municipalities have more than reached the end of their rope in terms of levy capacity. What you saw, when levy limits were first imposed, is that most municipalities levied in some way, shape, or form for capital. As your rate of inflation has far outpaced the percentage increase in net new construction, those dollars that you might have otherwise levied for capital now have to go for operating expenses. And eventually you get to the point where you have nothing else to cut. Other revenue generation sources that municipalities have looked at is say a wheel tax, which is not popular, to be quite honest.
Probably less popular than a referendum.
Yeah. And it's very limited. It gets collected actually by DOT, but then passed back to the municipality, has to specifically be used for transportation related expenses. But one of the things that we kind of learned as municipalities were looking at that as a revenue source is that it's not, it's really only applied on personal use vehicles. The higher the weight, those vehicles that are commercial generally fall outside of the purview of being subject to the wheel tax. Doesn't always generate a lot of revenue, so it's a tool, but it's not the end all be all. Impact fees, which you're already using, those are one-time fees. That's on the capital side. Converting your garbage to off the tax levy, charging for that separately. Same thing with recycling. Municipalities have done that. There is a a levy limit adjustment on the negative side that you have to look at with that. The formation of a stormwater utility is another one. So none of these, unfortunately, are the magic arrow to be able to kind of save the day. In most cases, it's needing to educate the public about why we have to go to referendum and try to do it. Or the flip side then is if it fails, cutting services, which nobody wants to do.
Or shrinking kids?
Well, so the shrinking of TIDs is potentially an option. You've done that once. What you need to weigh is if you're going to remove parcels from the TID, number one, it's got to be the whole parcel. And number two, it's got to be things that you're going to actually then get significant, bang for your buck. And a lot of these are tied to specific, municipal revenue obligations that you have outstanding. Really, what you potentially would want to look at from a strategy standpoint is what could we subtract out that's not tied to, any sort of municipal revenue obligation, but keep in mind that that's also then going to negatively impact you have to look at, what it does to the TID cash flow too.
Well, I can think of one thing, and that would be the senior center. Where we could generate immediate tax benefit were it to be built. Okay, moving on from that then, another concern of mine.
Did you want me to address the negative on TIDs?
Sure, yeah, go ahead. I thought you were done.
I go as long as you want me to go. So you're right. I mean, there are trade-offs with tax incremental financing. Part of it is the issue that you just raised where, in the case of say, residential development in particular, not, all development has a need for services, right? But certainly residential development has, potentially an increased need for services with people living and dwelling in the municipality. And you're not allowed to be able to collect the other operational costs for that would otherwise be generated through property taxes as if the TIF district never occurred and that development would occur on its own naturally. And that really is the trade-off. And back to when the TIF district was originally formed, that but-for test, and that really, to be very honest, is why it is very important to make sure that but-for test is satisfied. And generally speaking, it usually and always is. But if you didn't have the tax incremental finance districts, I think you could pretty safely say these developments would not be there.
Well, no, and you never know. And so you touched on something that,
well, I mean, to take it a step further, I mean, you do have, and I'm not gonna, get into speculation on it, but at the time those developments did occur, it's significant discussion with developers on, really the extraordinary cost that existed on these two sites and what it was going to take to allow development to occur. The significant cost of blasting for each of these, on each of these sites, the infrastructure costs that had to occur in order for this development to happen. So without the use of tax incremental financing, I think it's perhaps the developments would occur in some way, shape or form, but likely not to the extent that you have currently.
okay, well, to put a number on that, the MRO obligations for Overstone total 5.3 million. And for Rock Point, it was a little over 3 million. So I don't know how much blasting they had to do, but that's a lot of tax dollars. Another concern I have with TIFs is lack of transparency and oversight. So, you talk about a joint review board. So I was present at the meeting that was held in December with the joint review board. And there was a representative from Waukesha County, Patrick, and then I think it was Mike Janczak.
Mike Janis, and then
Janis.
a representative from the school districts and the community college.
I did not see anybody from the school district.
We had some
They were on.
that remoted in, and then one was not present.
Okay. All right, well. So when you're talking about oversight, for a board that, a joint review board that small, how much oversight is there when it comes to identifying projects and releasing those projects?
Really, the project approval process happens at the time that the TIF district is created and amended, and then, really it's the annual meeting process. So you go through, in our case, we go through, cash flow analysis. There's also what's called a PE 300 form that is submitted by the municipality to the Department of Revenue, documenting the revenues and expenses. And then it's also shown in terms of revenues and expenses in your annual financial statement. So those are kind of the primary sources.
Okay, so, and when we're talking about projects that have been identified, in last year's report, there was the water expansion project included a third source, which was tower and well. Now that's been changed in this presentation to interconnect. Who makes those changes?
The municipality and the board really has the ability to, move ahead. It really is an additional source of water, whether it be an interconnect or a ground well source that, rests with the board.
For the sake of what's in here, I made those changes.
Okay. Talking about the water project, you mentioned about potentially petitioning the PSC to reduce the rate of return. So it was like 1-for-1. Have you ever seen that done?
Yeah, we've successfully petitioned the PSC for lower rates of return in the cases where you have alternate revenue sources.
Okay.
This is, I will say, this is fairly, you've got a significant lift on your hands. You have a lot of projects relative to the size of the water utility. So the asset base that you have in existence right now compared to the asset base that you're gonna be adding is significant. So this is unlike anything I've ever seen before in terms of the projects that you have upcoming relative to the existing size of the water utility. So I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It's a significant lift to the PSC when we get to that point.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Do you know what the TID #1 fund balance was at the beginning of this year?
It's negative. It was a little over $500,000 in the negative at the beginning of this year.
Okay, well, the report from Wendy.
So the fund balance at the beginning of 2000, this would have been at the beginning of 2024, so I'm sorry, was negative 552,022. At the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, you were negative $1,097,218.
I can send you those reports. The same report.
What about TID #2?
At the beginning of 2024, you were negative $146,894. And at the end of 2024, $118,589.
Negative.
Were they supposed to be negative? Yes, oftentimes with TIF districts that have significant upfront costs, you start in the negative and then you work your way into the positive from a cumulative fund.
Are the following projections or no?
The development, I would say, is ahead of projection. The fund balance in the negative is behind projection.
Okay, so in 2025, the village owes 188,000 plus in interest against TID obligations, bonds and things like that. How does that get paid? Or does that just roll into the negative TID balance?
So it gets paid with the revenues of the tax incremental finance district. So in 2025, we're projecting, this is TID 1, we're projecting that you would have an annual positive difference between revenues and expenses of just under 350,000 for this year, and that includes the interest expense on the existing debt.
Okay,
So it goes to help reduce the debt, that $1 million deficit. So in this case, with no new projects, we project getting into the positive by the end of 2027 for TIF 1. And that's shown on slide 12. In 2026, next year, the end of 2026, for TIF 2.
Which financial institutions carry that debt? Who's accruing the interest?
The villages.
But who's carrying the debt load? Who funded the loans to us?
So with the debt that was out in the open market, those were competitively issued municipal securities. So you had an underwriter that purchased that debt and then parsed it off in the secondary market. With the case of the state trust fund loan, those were direct loans that were taken out through the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands, between the village and the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands.
Does Ehlers brokerage many of these?
No, we're not a broker. We're strictly a municipal advisor. So we recommend the method of sale and we help facilitate the sale. We're not purchasing the debt. We're also not placing it directly with a bank or any other institution. And these were competitively issued debt obligations that, like a construction project where you had defined bidding time. You had multiple underwriters that bid on that. There's a whole set of documents that we can provide you if you want that would show, the number of bidders that you had, what the winning bid was, who the financial institution, the underwriter that won it. If they had syndicate members as part of their bid, and then the official statement that went along with the debt. So that's all readily available information that either we or staff can provide you.
no, but I'll reserve my right to,
Yeah.
to call the witness.
Yeah.
When it goes into the positive, are we allowed to earn interest?
Yeah, in fact, we do show that here in the second column here.
If we've mostly addressed board questions, we can open it up to the public here to dig in a little bit further, unless anybody else would like to.
The only thing I was gonna say is in the multiple decades that I've lived here, if it wasn't for the TIF districts, we wouldn't have Overstone, we wouldn't have Rock Point, we wouldn't have Whispering Ridge, we wouldn't have, the new one that's going up. Am I correct?
I would say yes.
Whispering Ridge was not part of the TID district. Whispering Ridge North is part of the TID district, but Whispering Ridge Estates is not part of the TID district.
Or we wouldn't have it, that's what I'm saying.
Oh,
It was-
a large portion of, so Whispering Ridge, the condominium development originally was not. Obviously, the TIDs weren't around then.
Mhm.
Then there was a series of residential homes, the Whispering Ridge Estates was built prior to the TIDs. Whispering Ridge Estates North is in the TIDs.
Mhm.
So that's 38 homes.
But again, we wouldn't have those if it wasn't for.
True.
Well, you can't say that with certainty. No. It's your opinion.
Yeah.
It might be, but there's no thing that you could say for sure you wouldn't have.
Other than
No, you
other
can't,
than the
but
development.
we've been here, but nothing really, the only newly platted residential area was Whispering Ridge since Lannon Estates was put in what, the 60s or 70s, so.
Correct.
Jerry, you had a comment?
Well, Whispering Ridge was done as a PUD, and that's how development was done before there was TIF districts. And we would negotiate, consideration for the developer to do the PUD, mostly more density. And so it had nothing to do with TIF. It was built because it was financially feasible.
And
So to further expound on that, someone said Lannon Village Hills was built in the 50s, 60s. So there was no new subdivisions from the 60s until Whispering Ridge Estates condominiums. That went in, went bankrupt twice,
3 times.
3 times. And so Whispering Ridge Estates was able to finish out because they bought that on foreclosure from the bank.
Yeah.
That's what made that financially viable.
North Shore.
That's what made them be able to afford the PUD fees that the village was charging at the time. But absent of getting land on a foreclosure, there were no new subdivisions in a several decade span compared to what's happened over the last 7 years.
Any other, Jerry?
The but for is the thing in Lannon is bedrock. And Lannon Hills is up on the top of a hill on gravel. And, Whispering Ridge was fortunate that part of it was on gravel. They did have to do some blasting, but no development on the east side of town would go ahead except for the but for. And I dealt with 7 different developers for that in the town and just can't afford it with the blasting.
Anybody, yeah, go ahead. Why don't you guys just ask away, fire away at John?
Elevator, Proctor.
Yeah,
Well, I have a question sort of unrelated to the TIDs and the TIFs.
okay.
Is that Lannon, as you drive through it, doesn't have an appealing look with some of the buildings that are tear downable and that are paintable, that are, you know, it doesn't give a good look. I met a lady the other day that lived in Lannon years ago and she drove through and she said, you know, nothing has really changed other than the new developments. So does Lannon have the ability to make those properties presentable, whether it be paint or tear down
So
or?
we're gonna get to that in a later item on the
Okay,
agenda,
okay.
under the municipal code
Okay.
enforcement. So let's stick to the TID for now.
Yeah, I'm
if you
just
would,
thinking,
please.
who would want to come and develop in an area that looks
Did you have
like
any
that?
other questions?
No,
Okay.
thank you.
So, thanks for your presentation. I understand this so much better. It seems like the challenge for the board is you guys are just constantly getting squeezed because we keep bringing in more houses and that adds to your administrative expenses. But you're not getting much more income because, you know, those new houses aren't giving you any new income really. Because the extra income that they're getting from their value stays in the TIF, right? So, and we talked, and so what you said, Mr. Batiste, I mean, that's kind of why I'm here today, because that seems like the biggest challenge of everything. So I voted no for the referendum, and now I would vote yes, because I understand that you guys are screwed, basically. Because I think for the greater good, the TIFs are gonna help us. It's gonna help the community. But short term, it makes it tough on you guys. And there's not a lot of options for them. What if they reassess? Is that an option? I don't know if I'd like that, but if they reassess, then when they get more money? Well, if they get more money from the non-TIF people.
No, so really, it doesn't change how much you can actually levy,
Okay.
because again.
Oh, yeah, because
you can
your mill
only-
rate would go up or down.
You
Yeah.
can only increase your property tax levy by the percentage increase in net new construction.
Okay.
So,
It'll affect the mill rate,
Yeah.
likely,
it would,
But-
but it wouldn't necessarily drive your property taxes down.
right?
Because your property, if say they reassess and your value goes up, the tax rate goes down, but because your value went up, it might be the same, or actually, if you're, say you did something to the house in between reassessments, and it really goes up or something,
Right. It's always risky.
you know, you could actually, you know, go up.
So the referendum, how would that have increased administrative expense again?
So the
Income?
proposal was that the referendum, those tax dollars go right to the general fund that we can use for administrative expenses, as opposed to the TID funds that go into separate funds that have restricted uses.
Right. I guess that's good. It's just, I feel for these guys because, you know, they gotta cut unless we give more money. Basically.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, the only money or the only TIF money can be used in boundary TIF areas. Now, what happens to all the boundaries that aren't in a TIF area? We just don't get any improvement. We don't get any fixes. I don't
Well,
understand.
there's maybe two parts to that question. So the first part is, can you just have project expenses within the TID boundary itself? And the rule there is you can do, you can certainly, you know, anything inside the TID itself, that geographic area, that are eligible expenses can be undertaken, but you can also have project expenses within a half-mile radius of the TID boundary, provided again, they were identified project expenses as part of the project plan and eligible. I'm blanking on the second part of your question.
Half-mile radius.
Okay, the half-mile radius, what if you're not in the half-mile radius?
Then eligible expenses for the most part are not, you can't do. The only exception to that is water and sewer, where you might have to locate, say a well. The well might have to be located more than a half mile from the boundary of the TID, but it benefits the TID. Same thing with the wastewater treatment plant. That's another example where, say you had significant capacity purchase that you had to make from Sussex in order for the TID districts to occur. That could be an eligible expense, even though it's well more than a half mile from the boundary of the TID.
John, can you talk real quick on why you can also not use TID funds for things like the municipal building or the park up there?
Because the legislature says we can't.
I just wanted it to be out there.
It's just not permissible.
But John, some of these things might benefit non-TID residents, right? I mean, like,
Yeah, as a whole,
a new water
yes,
tower might
but-
benefit me and I'm not in the TID.
right, so as part of that, you know, the project plan, those projects were identified, and from an engineering standpoint, you had eligible expenses to the TID that, you know, were able to, for these areas that do benefit the district, that do pay for it. So it might be not 100% of the project expense, but a proportionate share of the expense, and that's fairly common for infrastructure projects, yes, sir.
That proportion that was written into the TID plans is 90%. So third source, water tower, those were allocated in the original TID plan at 90%.
What about police coverage? You know, I mean, none of that's gonna be covered with all the additional population. So the non-TID areas are really affected horribly. Horribly, with road usage and everything else. So how do you?
Well, the road reconstruction could help road
I'm not
reconstruction.
talking construction, I'm just talking in general, traffic increase. So then what do we do?
Suffer.
Yeah, we are suffering.
I think it's important to realize too that like the TID and the TIF are vehicles, again, long-term planning.
Yeah.
These properties are not always going to, once the TID closes, those properties start contributing tax revenue at their value.
And we're,
You know, we have the ability to take that bump from the levy, that one-time bump. I mean, ultimately, we are dealing with a levy that is smaller than the needs of the community, and this is a way to offset that to a certain extent. Do you agree?
Or to try to.
I think in addition to that, like all municipalities, eventually you do get to the point where you either have to make decisions on service levels versus the need for a referendum. And obviously that's left to the voters to decide. And I know you went through that once already.
now you're talking paying them off in 20 years.
None of us will be here anymore.
We won't.
Yeah.
We'll be here. So we're gonna suffer for 20 years.
But that is the role of government. The role of government is to do long-term planning, you know. There were people here, Jerry will attest to this, there were people here 30 years ago who made a 50-year plan, you know? They didn't do it because they're gonna be here, they're doing it because their children will be here.
My children.
I have kind of two parts to my question. One is, how long has that parcel of land been sitting there undeveloped? You know,
Which
the
one?
one where the senior assistant.
Forever.
Okay, and for sale for a while too.
Number of years, I couldn't
Number of
say for
years.
sure.
So it's
Three or-
not like
three or
hot
four,
on the
probably.
market and anybody looking to buy it.
Yeah.
And with that, a part of this, the next part of my question probably has to do with my still not totally understanding tips, although tonight has been extremely helpful. And I feel a bit more comfortable after getting this information. So I'm looking at the sheet where the incremental value, if there was a senior center, the tax increment is about $100,000 a year, and over the course of the years, it's a little over 3 million. How does that work with TIFs and the village board, all the trustees and the developer with contracts? Is there, is that something you negotiate so that we're not spending more money on reimbursing the developer than what we're going to get back? I'm assuming there is, but I figured I'll ask the question to make sure.
All of that stuff gets negotiated throughout the process of doing the developer agreement and talking with Ehlers about projections and what their ask is and figuring out whether or not it makes financial sense for the village to take on the risk of meeting that incentive request. So, and then it gets memorialized in the development agreement and in the MRO, which will spell out the financial arrangement.
And can we define MRO for those
The
of us?
municipal revenue obligation.
Thank you.
So that's a commitment that the village makes to the developer. And all the terms and conditions are outlined in that, and that becomes part of the development agreement as well.
And the way it works then is that the developer does some infrastructure improvements. And then as they go through their development, then they get reimbursed by the, because I've seen line items like giving Berg Development some money. So I'm just trying to understand how this works.
So they're all negotiated individually and separately. There are standard ways that we try to operate, and that is typically the methodology, yes, is, you know, they expend the money, create the project, demonstrate increment and value, and they in turn then get compensated. So we've tried to be very diligent and intentional in our approach to negotiating these agreements. And they have all been on a pay-go basis. And that is because we did not want to take any risk of putting out a bunch of funds, with the exception of one, and that was actually Berg, I think. We did actually advance a little bit of money to him. But it's all basically, look, we're willing to help contribute to make this possible for you because we believe in your project. But you're not gonna get paid until we get paid. In other words, you build the project, you create the increment and the value. We recognize the revenue and we will share a portion of that with you. Or an occupancy type of arrangement like we did with Rock Point Village. That was a two-pronged. So they got a certain incentive amount when each building came online with an occupancy permit, and then they get an ongoing MRO amount. And those percentages, again, are all negotiated separately as their own individual deals. So there's nothing written in stone that says we have to do it a certain way. it's just depends on the project.
Are developer agreements public record
Yes. Mhm.
online, or do we have to come to get them, or?
You know, we can put those online, I believe.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Scan them all in.
So the pay-go, council has advised me to explain, what that is. So that's, the pay-as-you-go. So again, that's kind of the idea of we pay on an annual basis, much like you've seen in some of these forecasts, you see like an annual amount and those percentages of the increment, the share percentage, we're paying that out each year as we go. And then there's, in all cases so far, in these TIDs, there's a cap. So it's not into perpetuity. It's, we're gonna share revenue, let's say 60-40 or 50-50 up to X dollar amount. And once that cap is met, then that obligation has been met and it's no longer a liability on the TID.
How long those usually last? How long?
Well, right now, they've got them forecasted out in these pro formas, so if you have a hard copy of this, Jan, that shows the current projections.
So, yeah, those are the years that are projected to be paid off.
I don't think there's anything precluding us from prepaying that. I don't think any of the developers would say, no, I don't want that money. Right, so if we got into a situation where we wanted to prepay, we could do that, and I believe that's the case with all of our debt as well.
Yeah, there's call features on the debt. You can't prepay it, with the exception of the state trust fund loans, those are
Right.
prepayable.
Yeah.
Really, at any time of 30 days written notice, the debt that was issued in the open market that had a call feature generally around year 7. Somewhere around there, so you can prepay the debt. And if the TIF district, would be in a position to close sooner than that, you can still close it, put those funds in escrow, keep paying on the debt until the call date, and then call and prepay it.
Did I accurately explain
Great
pay-go?
job.
Okay.
I just have one quickie, if you don't mind. What happens if property values take a dump with all these projections and stuff?
Yeah, so these are based off of where values exist today. They're
Right.
not, they're not projections, they're known values, released by Department of Revenue. If they were to decline significantly, you would see the amount of increment, generation go down pretty considerably each year, but you have to think through under what type of scenarios you would see a pretty catastrophic loss in value. I mean, you think back to the Great Recession and you certainly had years where you had negative, equalized value growth trends, or at least flat equalized growth trends, but in some cases you still had at least 1%, 0.5%, something like that, not crazy, but, you still had.
Did you have appreciation factors built in, or is it set at 0 when you did your modeling?
In the cash flows that you see, there's a 1.5% appreciation,
Pretty modest, yeah.
but no increase to the tax rate. So the tax rate stays steady.
Colleen, do we have any good questions on, I'm sorry.
We do not have any
Your
online.
hand was behind the owl.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Shirley.
I'm just curious, I'm not sure if, either of the lots are in the TIDs. I would assume the one by Mims would not be, but I didn't know if the one by the school would be, because it's near the area that's been built.
That is not, neither of them are limited.
This one over here, the lot between that the village bought over here is in the TID. The one that's for sale off of Good Hope is not.
I would have thought the other. Anyways, I'm just wondering if the village is lacking money, what was the reasoning behind buying the lots? When maybe we could have used it for police and other things that could not be used because of the TIDs.
So we used TID funds to purchase the land, so we couldn't use that as John pointed out
But
earlier, we can't use the TID funds
But he
to,
said the one on Good Hope Road.
And to be clear, the one on Good Hope, was a lot that was purchased approximately 9 years ago, I believe.
Yeah.
And that was because, the person who was developing it wanted to sink a well there. We were close to having water available there. He wanted a well. We were not going to give him a permit to put a well in when water was on the doorstep. We ended up settling with him by saying, hey, let's just buy this lot from you for what you want for it. You don't have to build a house on it right now. We'll make you whole, and the village will sit on that land until the water and sewer project are done and that lot is fully improved. And that's what we did. We purchased that lot approximately, I believe it was 9 years ago. And that has stayed a property that we have, maintained and owned. And now that it's fully improved, it has realized its highest and best value. And so we've decided to sell it. So that's why it's listed for sale.
and when she says we, none of us were on the
No,
board.
not us, yeah, no. It was something that was done by the board in a previous iteration.
But with good cause. I think there was threats of legal action and things of that nature, and rather than deal with a protracted litigation, they decided to purchase the land.
I was president at the time.
Oh, we're sorry.
Yeah, it was-
So it's your
it was
fault,
to
Terry.
avoid litigation.
Ben,
If I may, I'd like to point out some other benefits, some wins that the village has already, in my opinion, realized.
sure, just speak loud so they can hear you on.
Sure. So my name's Ben Wood. I'm with Strand Associates. We're the village engineer for Lannon, and my wife and I happen to live here. So one of the benefits that hasn't been talked about is utility connection fees. So take, for example, Rock Point Village. I think in total, they paid between $850,000 and $1 million in utility connection fees. The lion's share of that went to the water utility, with some that went to the sewer utility. So right now, the connection fees in this community are, at the time they were higher, but they've been readjusted. $8,000 per connection for water and $6,000 per connection for sewer. Now, those fees, believe it or not, when the TIDs were open, the water fee was even higher, and that was in addition to the cost of rock, part of what the but-for challenge was. So as each of these developments are happening, they're also paying those connection fees. Those connection fees went to pay back historic debt that the village took on to create the water utility before the Great Recession and the bottom fell out of the housing market. So to get into a position right now where that historic debt has been addressed through new connection fees by these developments that have happened inside the TIDs, that doesn't show up on any of these kind of balance and cash flow sheets, but that's a significant liability that's been taken care of due to the developments in those TIDs. Another one I want to talk about is just general roads and the road conditions. The roads in this community were last done in 1997 when village-wide sewer went in. And road maintenance was deferred because it was always thought that water was going to go in, and it took a long, long time for water to go in, more than 20 years, very recently, as we all know. That total water project happened outside of the TID. But it did something really significant. When the TIDs were created in July of 2018, we didn't know that there was a massive water expansion project that was going to start getting planned later that year and over the next year or so. The thought at the time the TIDs were created, I believe the annual road maintenance budget was about $15,000 per year.
Yeah.
And there were roads, State Street being the primary one, that were literally crumbling apart, and there just was not the general fund available to fix those. So a significant thought process in creating the TIDs is that, well, if you create the TIDs at the end of it, when they close, then you'll finally have this big bump in kind of levy. And then you can actually have a serious conversation about funding these programs. But we scored a huge win along the way with the USDA project, which was 80% grant funded in the end, where they allowed full with reconstruction of the roadways wherever water main was going in. So that was another significant win. So I know, and quite frankly, as a resident here, partially share the frustration that there seems to be a lot of money available for sewer projects. A lot of money seems to be available for water projects. A lot of money for purchasing land for a pocket park, when these things frankly don't rise to the top of most of our priority list in the village. I think that's been expressed here. The reality is the village is constrained to being able to pay for certain things out of certain buckets. And what I've observed over the boards that have been here from 2018 until now is a willingness to use the tools available and apply them where they make sense. And as John kind of pointed out, unfortunately, funding emergency services, there's no magic arrow to take care of that one. But there are some, I would like to think, maybe not magical, but some pretty special arrows that the village has employed over the last 6 years to make some significant wins. And as Colleen said, use this as a vehicle to end up at, in my opinion, a pretty good spot with the help of the infrastructure, which in my mind I see is when you take care of that, you're taking a future liability off of the books because we're not deferring maintenance in that regard.
Thank you. I will also add that I think while this will help us with a nice bump, quite honestly, I speculate that it won't be significantly long after this bump that we will already have our back against the wall again. Because the costs of operating continue to go up at rates that are higher than the state levy limits allow us to increase our levy. And we are going to face continued pressure once we use up that bucket. So that $57,500 of administrative costs that we're allocating from the TID right now, when we get those bumps, that gets taken right off the top. So that's another reason why we don't want to continue to fund expenses today, or that we really need to find a way to budget for in the future when we don't have that source anymore. Because when the TIDs close, now we've got all this stuff budgeted and we have to be able to pay for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, your levy limit issue existed before the TIDs were created.
Yeah, and unless they reform, unless there's some sort of levy limit reform, every municipality in this state is going to be battling this.
I mean, you think about the percentage of your tax levy that goes to pay for fire related services and public safety related services. It's a pretty tremendous amount. It existed that way, before the TIF districts were created in 2018. Patrick's right. I mean, you're going to continue to face levy limit constraints going forward. I think the benefit of the tax incremental finance districts, besides just the products that you have and things that you can be proud of within the village, is you now are in a position to deploy the TID towards some of these capital projects that you also need to get done, and the TIDs can help contribute towards that if you so choose to. But that's that's the decision that the previous boards made when these TIF districts were created, as designating them as eligible expenses. That's the decision that the Joint Review Board made in terms of determining that the but-for test was satisfied without significant infrastructure investments. So that's, to Ben's point, those are the tools that you can use at your disposal. It's not, you know, the magic bullet in terms of some of the operating expenses and some of the needs that arise, but it is a very valuable tool in the toolbox for the village.
No questions online still?
No, nobody has anything for me.
So we're about 75 minutes into this. I think, hopefully this has been informative. Hopefully it's answered a lot of questions. I'm sure it's brought up some other questions. And that's fine. These are very, very complicated concepts, and this is a complicated tool. And I certainly want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to understand this and what we're doing with these to their satisfaction. That is the goal. So if you do have additional questions, please email them to me or call me, and I will get an answer. Okay, and that goes for anybody here on the board as well. If you want to talk about it, whatever, I will do that. I will continue to have some public meetings on my own, and I'll do my best to answer the questions. I've been here since the inception and creation of these, so I'm a little more versed in some of them, but I'm not an expert by any means. So thank you, John. I appreciate your time tonight, as always, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.